It remains the single worst maritime disaster in the history of the United States. More people died on it than on the Titanic. And almost no one has ever heard of it. In the last days of the American Civil War, a Mississippi steamboat packed far beyond reason blew apart in the dark, and well over 1,000 men who had just survived the war burned or drowned within sight of the shore. They were not wealthy passengers. They were exhausted, skeletal soldiers, most of them just released from the worst prison camps of the war, finally on their way home. This is the story of the steamboat Sultana, the disaster that killed more Americans than the Titanic, and the cruel accident of history that made the world forget it almost overnight. To understand it, you have to understand the moment. In April 1865, the Civil War was ending. General Lee had surrendered. And across the South, the gates of the Confederate prison camps were opening, releasing tens of thousands of Union soldiers who had endured conditions almost beyond belief. The most infamous of those camps was Andersonville, in Georgia. Built for a fraction of the men crammed into it, it had become a place of starvation, disease, and death, where thousands of prisoners died of dysentery and exposure. The men who walked out of Andersonville and camps like Cahaba were often little more than living skeletons. These men had survived the unimaginable. They had survived the battlefields, and then they had survived the camps. Now, with the war over, all they wanted was to go home to their families in the North. The United States government gathered them at collection points along the Mississippi to send them upriver, and it agreed to pay to get them there. And that payment is where the disaster begins. The government paid private steamboat operators a fee for every soldier they carried north, roughly $5 a man, more for an officer. Suddenly, each ragged former prisoner was not just a man going home. He was money. And the more men a captain could cram onto his boat, the more he would be paid. One of the boats waiting for that human cargo was the Sultana, a wooden sidewheel steamboat working the Mississippi. She was a normal riverboat of her day, and her legal, safe capacity was around 376 people, passengers and crew combined. Remember that number. 376. As the Sultana steamed south and reached Vicksburg, her chief engineer found a serious problem. One of her 4 boilers had sprung a leak. The proper fix was to remove and replace the faulty metal, a job that would take several days. And that was the one thing her captain could not afford. Because thousands of released prisoners were waiting at Vicksburg for a ride home, and every one of them was worth money. If the Sultana sat in dock for days being repaired, that human cargo, and its enormous payday, would go to a rival boat. So a fateful decision was made. Instead of the real repair, a mechanic simply patched the leaking boiler with a thin metal plate, a temporary fix meant to hold just long enough. It was a patch over a bomb. The boilers of a steamboat were already the most dangerous thing on the river, high-pressure vessels of superheated steam that exploded with terrifying regularity in this era. Patching one to save time, on a boat about to be overloaded like no boat should ever be, was a gamble with more than 2,000 lives. Because as the repair was rushed, the loading began, and it did not stop. Soldiers were packed onto every deck of the Sultana, shoulder to shoulder, until the boat groaned under the weight. When she finally pulled away from Vicksburg, she was carrying an estimated 2,100 people, and by some counts far more. Look again at the numbers. A boat legally rated for 376 was now carrying well over 2,000 human beings. She was loaded to roughly 6 times her safe capacity. The decks visibly sagged. The men were so tightly packed that many could barely sit down. And beneath them, 4 boilers, one of them held together by a hasty patch, strained to push all that weight upriver. The day before she was lost, the Sultana stopped at Helena, Arkansas, where a photographer had set up on the bank. The soldiers crowded to the rail to get into the picture, and the boat listed so hard that the crew begged them back from the edge. That photograph survives. It shows a steamboat so solid with human beings that the decks seem built of men. It is the last image of them alive. And other steamers sat at those same landings that week, licensed, sound, and nearly empty, ready to carry their fair share of the men home. They should have taken hundreds of these soldiers between them. Instead, because of the bribes, they pulled away with room to spare, while the Sultana groaned north under a load that no boat on the river should ever have carried. Think of the arithmetic of survival for just one of these men. He had beaten the odds on the battlefield. He had beaten the far worse odds of the prison camp, where a huge share of the inmates died. He had survived all of it. And then, out of every boat on the Mississippi, he was placed on the one that would not make it home. And the river itself was against them. It was spring, and the Mississippi was swollen with meltwater, running high, cold, and fast, in places overflowing miles beyond its banks. The overloaded Sultana had to fight hard against that powerful current, working her patched boilers even harder, as she churned north past Memphis in the dark. The top-heavy boat also rocked as she went. As she leaned one way and then the other, the water inside her great boilers sloshed from side to side. On a patched, overworked boiler, that shifting water and uneven heating was exactly the kind of stress that could turn a steam vessel into a blast furnace waiting for a spark. It is worth being clear about why so many men ended up on one boat. The army was supposed to spread the released prisoners fairly across several steamers. Instead, officers in charge of loading at Vicksburg were bribed, and nearly the entire mass of men bound for that stretch of river was funneled onto the Sultana alone, so that one captain, and the officers taking kickbacks, could collect the fee for all of them. A quartermaster named Reuben Hatch was at the center of the corruption, an officer already suspected of fraud, who helped steer the human payload toward the Sultana. Greed, not accident, decided how many men would be standing on those decks when the boilers let go. And remember who those men were. Many weighed under 100 pounds, ravaged by scurvy, dysentery, and months of near starvation. Some could barely stand. They had been promised a quick trip up the river to freedom, and in their weakened state they packed themselves gratefully onto a boat that was already a disaster waiting to happen. Steamboat boilers were the great killers of the age. In the decades before the Sultana, exploding boilers had killed thousands of people on America's rivers, so often that it was almost accepted as a cost of travel. The technology was dangerous, the regulation was weak, and a boiler pushed too hard was one of the most lethal machines a person could stand near. The Sultana also had almost nothing aboard to save the people on her. A boat meant for a few hundred had a single small yawl and a scattering of life preservers, useless against 2,000 men in a flooded river at night. When the moment came, there would be no boats to lower, no drill, no plan. There would only be the water. At around 2 o'clock in the morning on the 27th of April, 1865, about 7 miles north of Memphis, it happened. With most of the exhausted men asleep on the decks, 3 of the Sultana's 4 boilers exploded, almost at once, in a single catastrophic blast. The explosion tore the heart out of the boat. A geyser of superheated steam and scalding water erupted upward through the packed decks, killing and maiming men where they slept. The blast hurled bodies high into the night air and far out into the black water. The 2 great smokestacks came crashing down onto the crowd below. And then came the fire. The shattered boat, built almost entirely of wood, caught almost instantly. Within minutes the Sultana was a floating inferno, lighting up the night. Men who had not been killed by the blast now faced an impossible choice, to burn on the ship, or to jump into the freezing, mile-wide flood below. Most jumped. And here the cruelty of it deepened. These were not strong men. They were emaciated survivors of prison camps, weak, sick, many unable to swim at all, plunging into a cold and furious river in total darkness. Hundreds drowned within minutes. Others clung to debris, to drowning comrades, to anything that floated, and were swept downstream in the dark. The water itself was a killer. Swollen with spring snowmelt, the Mississippi ran frigid, and for men whose bodies had almost nothing left in reserve, the cold did its work fast. Hypothermia took many who had not burned and had not drowned, quietly pulling them under while any rescue was still hours away. From the Memphis waterfront, people woke to a strange glow on the northern sky and a sound like distant thunder rolling down the river. Word spread that a steamer was burning. But by the time help could reach the spot, the Sultana was little more than a skeleton of fire, drifting and settling into the flood, the water around her full of the living and the dead. The survivors were scattered for miles down the flooded river. Some clung to the tops of half-submerged trees along the drowned banks, waiting for a dawn that many did not live to see. Boats from Memphis and other steamers eventually came out to pull the living, and the dead, from the water. The rescue went on for hours. The blast was so violent it was heard in Memphis, 7 miles away. A column of steam and flame lit up the night sky over the river. Red-hot coals and shattered timber rained down on the men in the water. The pilot house was gone, the upper decks collapsed, and hundreds were scalded or crushed in the first few seconds, before anyone even understood what had happened. For the men who reached what should have been the shore, there was a final cruelty. The river was so far over its banks that the trees stood in open water for miles. There was no dry land to crawl onto, only flooded forest. Survivors clung to branches in the cold current through the rest of the night, and some, too weak to hold on, simply slipped under before dawn. Rescue came slowly out of the dark. The gunboat Essex and the steamer Pocahontas, along with smaller boats from Memphis, pushed out onto the flood and began pulling the living and the dead from the water and the treetops. Men were plucked from branches miles downstream. The work went on well past sunrise. The hospitals of Memphis filled with the scalded, the half-drowned, and the frozen. And the dying did not stop when the sun came up. Over the following days, many more of the rescued succumbed to their burns, to pneumonia, and to bodies simply too broken by prison and exposure to recover. The toll kept climbing long after the fire went out. When it was over, the scale was almost incomprehensible. The most widely cited death toll is about 1,168 people, and some historians put it higher still, perhaps as many as 1,800. Either way, it was more than would die on the Titanic nearly 50 years later. It was, and remains, the deadliest maritime disaster in American history. For weeks afterward, bodies surfaced along the Mississippi, some carried scores of miles downstream before they were found. Many were never identified, and were buried in unmarked graves along the river. Families in the North waited for men who had survived the war and the camps, and who now would simply never arrive, with no grave to visit and, for a long time, no clear answer as to why. And the men who died carried a special kind of tragedy. They had survived the deadliest war in American history. They had survived the horror of the prison camps. They had come within a few days' journey of walking back through their own front doors. And they died anyway, on the way home, because a boat had been loaded like cargo and repaired like an afterthought. So how does the worst maritime disaster in a nation's history simply vanish from its memory? The answer is timing, and it is heartbreaking. Just 13 days earlier, President Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated. The nation was still in deep mourning and shock. And only the day before the Sultana exploded, Lincoln's killer, John Wilkes Booth, had finally been cornered and shot. The newspapers were consumed by the end of the war, the death of the president, and the dramatic manhunt for his assassin. A steamboat full of anonymous common soldiers, exploding far out west on the Mississippi, could not compete for the front page. There were no famous names among the dead. No senators, no celebrities, just farm boys and laborers who had already given years of their lives to the war. Their disaster arrived at the exact moment the country had no attention left to give. And so, almost immediately, the Sultana slipped out of the headlines, and then out of history. In the months that followed, there were investigations, and plenty of blame to go around: the bribery, the overloading, the patched boiler. One officer, a captain named Frederick Speed, was court-martialed and convicted of overcrowding the boat. But his conviction was later overturned, and in the end, no one was truly held accountable for the deaths of more than 1,000 men. That is perhaps the hardest part. This was not a freak act of nature. Every step toward the catastrophe was a human choice. The choice to pay by the head. The choice to cram 6 times the safe number of men aboard. The choice to patch the boiler instead of fixing it. Every one of those choices was preventable, and together they killed more Americans than any shipwreck ever has. And almost nothing changed because of it. Exploding boilers went on killing river travelers for years. The Sultana never became the cautionary tale that reformed steamboat travel, because the country had barely registered that it happened. A disaster that should have rewritten the rules instead vanished, and the same danger stayed on the water. The survivors carried it alone. One remembered being thrown from the deck into the blackness and clinging all night to a fragment of the shattered boat, listening as the cries around him in the dark faded, one by one, until the dawn. They had lived through the war and through the camps, and this was the memory that never left them: the night on the river. For half a century, the men who lived held reunions. They called themselves the Sultana survivors, and each year they gathered to read out the roll of the dead and to remember the fire. As they aged, the reunions shrank, and the empty chairs multiplied, until the last survivor was gone, and with him went the final living memory of that night. There are a couple of small memorials now, and a devoted handful of historians who refuse to let the story die. But for a disaster of this size, the silence is deafening. Ask most Americans to name the worst shipwreck in their history, and they will say the Titanic. Almost no one will say the Sultana. The survivors never forgot. For decades afterward, the men who lived through the Sultana held reunions, gathering each year to remember the comrades who had died in the water that night. They knew what had happened. They knew how many had been lost. But the country around them had already moved on. Today the Sultana is a footnote, if it appears at all. Most Americans have never heard the name. There is no famous film, no household story, no place in the national memory, for the 1,700 or so men who may have died that night, on a river, in the dark, at the very end of a war they had already survived. They had names, and homes waiting. Farm towns across Ohio, Indiana, and Tennessee. Wives, parents, and children counting down the days. Whole regiments that had marched off years earlier were finally coming home, thinner and fewer than they had left. For more than 1,000 of those families, the man simply never walked back through the door, and the reason was a boat that had been sold out by the head. So remember them now. Remember that the worst maritime disaster in American history was not a luxury liner and its millionaires, but a wooden riverboat crammed with starving former prisoners of war, sold home by the head and sent up a flooding river on a patched boiler. They deserved to make it home. Most of them never did. Below exists for exactly these stories, the disasters beneath the surface of history, the wrecks and the drownings the world chose to forget. If you want more of them, the famous, the forgotten, and the ones that should never have happened, subscribe and stay with us. This has been Below.